Select all squares with traffic lights. If there are none, click Skip.
Slumped forward in his chair, his elbow propped on his desk, and his chin resting on his hand, Andrew maneuvered his mouse cursor to click the matching images. Fuck off, he groaned as the CAPTCHA refreshed. He must have missed one. This time he scanned the image more carefully to make sure he wouldn't miss any. It was a generic, low-resolution scene of a road with traffic lights above it, presumably taken from Google Street View or something similar, complete with cars with their license plates and occupants blurred out. On either side of the street was bald prairie, not dissimilar in appearance to the land around his own small town, but really it could have been anywhere. At the bottom of one of the traffic light posts was a dark shape, much taller than any of the vehicles, but little more than a blur, impossible to make out clearly due to the low resolution of the image. This time, Andrew clicked all the right squares and solved the CAPTCHA correctly, allowing him to post his reply on the image board he frequented. The discussion in the thread was heating up. Not a minute later, someone had replied to his post, calling him a faggot and his opinions retarded. Truly edifying stuff. Andrew cracked his knuckles, stood up, stretched his arms above his head, and went for a piss, cooking up a reply in his head. The light was beginning to change, and out his front window he could see that the sun was setting. It was about time to get some supper. On the way to the washroom, he fished his phone from his pocket and put on some music, an ambient electronic album that had been playing in his head all day. The sound washed over him until the noise of the stream of piss hitting the water drowned it out. He made to turn the volume up, but a vision of dropping his phone into the toilet flashed through his mind, and he thought better of it. He finished up and washed his hands, then turned the volume up and made for the kitchen, phone in hand, gentle pulses of music occupying his mind. He had leftovers from last night in the fridge, so prep was quick. In fact, he didn't even bother taking the stir-fry out of the Tupperware. He just nuked it for a couple minutes, grabbed a fork, and headed back to the computer. The image board thread was still there waiting for him, the discussion still at a lively pace. He shoveled a bite of beef and broccoli with rice into his mouth, then transferred the Tupperware to his left hand so he could control the mouse with his right, and got right back into it. Someone in the thread had expressed an incorrect opinion that Andrew simply could not allow to go unaddressed. He typed his reply and moved on to the CAPTCHA so that he could post it. This time the CAPTCHA asked him to select all squares containing crosswalks. This scene was another street, this time at twilight, just like it was outside at the moment, but this street was in what looked like a more residential area. In fact, it looked strikingly familiar, almost like he had driven down it before, but then again, it was low res, and anonymized enough that it could be almost anywhere, and Andrew was not one of those geo-guessers. The only thing that gave him pause was an elongated dark shape in the middle of the street, just behind one of the crosswalks he had to select to solve his CAPTCHA puzzle. It was blurry, but he thought he could make out a vaguely human-like shape, or at least he thought he could distinguish two legs and a body, though judging by the size of the vehicles at the side of the street, both the limbs and the body were much too long to belong to any man, and something about its shape and proportions was distinctly unsettling. Eventually, he turned his gaze away from the anomaly, solved the CAPTCHA, posted his comment, and resumed his browsing. After some time, he realized his stir-fry had made him thirsty and left him with a nasty, sticky film on the inside of his mouth, not helped by the fact that he had neglected to brush his teeth that morning. He got up and poured himself a glass of water, swishing it around his mouth and between his teeth to rinse out the nasty feeling. Of course, not long after finishing the water, he had to get up again for another piss. By now, the only light coming in through his front window was from the street lamps. A cloudy, moonless night had fallen fast. Returning to his chair, there were several replies awaiting him. He made a new post and typed out his replies, and of course had to solve a CAPTCHA to post his response. It instructed him to select all squares containing vehicles. This one was harder to make out, since it was dark. The source photo must have been taken in the dead of night, which was unusual. Stranger still, he could have sworn up and down that the image was a view of the main street, leading to his own neighborhood. No one particular landmark gave it away, but the configuration of electrical boxes, street lamps, sidewalks, and he would swear even some of the parked vehicles, was so eerily familiar that he could only conclude it was in fact Brookview Drive. Andrew's interest was piqued. A cursory search engine query about what it could mean if his neighborhood appeared in a CAPTCHA image turned up no useful results, so he decided to do an experiment. He canceled his post on the image board, reset his modem, and changed the location on his VPN, then returned to the thread and typed up a throwaway shitpost to generate a CAPTCHA so he could see whether this had done anything. It was not exactly the same image, but similarly dark, as though taken at night. It was still a street, and it again asked him to select cars. Frowning, he leaned in towards his monitor and looked closer. "What the fuck?" was all he could manage to say. He was pretty sure the image was the same street, Brookview Drive. He would have sworn by it, except further along the street, closer to the turnoff for his part of the neighborhood. He scanned every inch of it, searching for confirmation, some landmark that would prove his suspicion. And then he saw it. Right at the edge of a pool of light cast by a street lamp, the tall figure stood, one long limb stretched ahead of it like it was in motion, taking a step. It was cut off by the edge of the image, and still blurry, but he could make out enough of it to make his heart drop. It stood upright like a man, but was far taller and longer limbed. Its arms, or at least what Andrew assumed to be its arms, reached down nearly to the ground, despite its height and upright posture, and its legs were grotesquely long and skinny. He zoomed in his screen as much as he could to get a better view and see what the thing was, but was left with a view that was no clearer and a feeling of mounting unease. With his screen zoomed in on it, the thing loomed closer, its identity still unclear, but its uncanny proportions even more evident, and Andrew found himself zooming back out and closing the CAPTCHA pop-up to avoid looking at it. As soon as it was off his screen, he began to dismiss it. It must have simply been a person walking, distorted from being blurred out, or even just some object blurred out on Street View, an anomaly, some sort of artifact of anonymizing the already low-resolution images. Explaining this to himself, half in his head and half muttered under his breath, went some way towards putting it out of his mind, though he still could not understand why the images seemed to be from his own neighborhood. Or perhaps he had only imagined they looked familiar. The evening was wearing on, and he had not slept much last night. In any case, the discussion on the image board had lost its allure entirely. He leaned back in his chair and stretched his arms over his head, yawning, then cast a sidelong glance at the box of tissues on his computer desk, and decided what he was doing next. He would watch one of his favorite cam girls, relax himself, and then hit the hay. Solid plan. He navigated over to the long familiar website he favored for such diversions to see who was online. He saw none he recognized, but there were plenty to choose from, and he settled on a 30-something brunette woman with glasses, whose rather plain beauty seemed very attainable, which he felt made his fantasy more realistic. Much to his chagrin, he was forced to solve a CAPTCHA to enter the show, and his heart sank when he saw it was yet another image CAPTCHA. What were the chances? This was getting old. Maybe he'd better just call it a night. The image loaded and his blood froze. There was no questioning it this time. The image was his own neighborhood, his very own street leading up to the cul-de-sac where his house was. All 4 squares on the right side of the image were taken up by the entity, the same one as before, looking the same direction the camera was, towards his cul-de-sac. Andrew closed the browser, his cam girls forgotten entirely. He swallowed down a lump in his throat, then stood up from his chair. He paced around the room a little, then stopped and looked towards his front window. It looked straight towards the entrance to his cul-de-sac, right towards where the image from his last CAPTCHA would have been taken from. It crossed his mind to go peer out the window and see if he could see anything, but he told himself it was silly. There was nothing out there. Besides, it was too dark to see anything anyway. Unless I catch a glimpse of it right at the edge of the light from the street lamp. His heart fluttered. He did not want to see it. He sprinted down the hall towards the window, averting his eyes from it, not daring to look outside, and drew the curtains shut, then sprinted back to his computer. He was being silly, he knew, but he was creeped out. He had always hated stuff like this. Back at his computer, he sat down and steadied his breathing, then opened a new browser window. He tried several descriptions of the entity in a search engine, but nothing really matched, and he did not have much to go off of anyway. It was a fool's errand besides. How would this make him feel better? He would just end up scaring himself silly reading about cryptids and the like. Scrolling down through the results, he was about to listen to his better judgment and give up his search, when one of the results caught his eye. It was a website cataloging cryptids and other supposed supernatural phenomena, and it was specific to his local area. Hesitating, he hovered his cursor over the link to the website. Am I really about to do this? He asked himself aloud with a sigh. The noise of his furnace turning on nearly made him jump out of his seat. His house began to click and rattle, as it always did when the heat kicked in, and he was not about to let his own HVAC scare him. He ignored the thumping and shuffling sound from the front of his house, turned his attention back to his computer, and clicked the link. He was greeted with another CAPTCHA in order to access the website. You gotta be fucking kidding me, he groaned, trying to assure himself that he was annoyed and not scared. The CAPTCHA took forever to load. This time it was not one continuous image, but each square seemed to be a different scene. The first few were so dark he couldn't make out what they were meant to be at all, and he double-checked what it was even asking him to select.
Select all squares containing Andrew's room.
The squares loaded one by one, from left to right, and top to bottom. The resolution improved, and the picture began to come together. His house from the outside, his front door, the front door open, his foyer, the hallway, the entrance to the office he was in. With a sickening certainty, Andrew turned around in his chair and looked out towards the hallway behind him, just in time to see his fate. The entity was unnervingly tall and lanky, hideous to behold, and loping down the hallway towards him with an uncanny, loose-limbed gait, its black maw gaping to envelop his face.